Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast. I'm Doug Campbell, an assistant professor of philosophy at Alma College in Michigan. And I'm also the host of the Ancient Philosophy Podcast, which is the podcast that explores important issues in ancient philosophy, whether that's in Greece, Rome, the Near East, India, China, or beyond. Today's episode is about ancient skepticism, specifically the kind of skepticism that gets invented by Sextus Empiricus in the Roman imperial period and that we call Pyrrhonian skepticism. And we'll distinguish it shortly from other forms of skepticism. Whether it is Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Epicureans, or so on, everyone places knowledge at the center of the good life, what it means to live a fulfilling life as a human being. Sure, Epicurus, for instance, thought that knowledge was merely instrumentally good, that knowledge, for instance, in a way served pleasure or fit into a hedonistic worldview. For him, knowing that death was neither good nor bad helped us feel less pain at the thought of it. But still, knowledge was a pretty big deal for Epicurus. Now, that's true on the one hand. So it's true on the one hand that we have a bunch of philosophers and philosophical schools that have prized knowledge, whether intrinsically or instrumentally. But on the other hand, there's always been a strain of ancient Greek philosophy that has denied claims to knowledge. This strain of ancient philosophy that has denied knowing things, we see perhaps most prominently early on in Plato's Apology, where this is a text we've explored in an earlier episode, where Socrates, Plato's character, develops this idea of human wisdom, that wisdom means knowing the limits of your own knowledge. Specifically, it's about knowing that you don't know all these important, lofty things like what justice is and what courage is. And if we dug deeper into Plato and the way that his dialogues, like the Apology, had been received by ancient thinkers, we'd actually see more examples of this skeptical tradition in antiquity. Specifically, one of the things that we'd find much later after Plato, a very long time after Plato, we'd find this school of thought that occupies us in today's episode. And this school of thought is, again, what we call Pyrrhonian skepticism. And it is chiefly associated with Sextus Empiricus, whose dates we don't know exactly, but he lived probably around 160 AD to 210 AD. And this school of thought has its name come from the Greek word skepsis, which means investigation or inquiry or examination. We could turn it into an adjective, skeptikos or skeptikon, which means investigative or related to inquiry, related to examination. Let's dig deeper into this particular ancient philosophical tradition. In English, to be skeptical is to have very high standards for accepting something as true. If you describe someone as skeptical, you would be saying that they were not easily convinced. If you described yourself as skeptical, you might say that you've got doubts about something, that you're reluctant to agree for some reason. That's not really what ancient skepticism means. Certainly, there are some similarities, and that's why we have taken their word skepsis and its related cognate forms like skeptikos, and that we've turned them into the word skeptical and skepticism, right? But the skeptics aren't merely people who are just doubting things, and they're not people who are just very hard to convince or very hard to persuade. They've got a very rigorous philosophy, and the meaning of their name, skepsis, suggests that they're always examining and inquiring. They don't think that inquiry is useless or that knowledge is impossible. After all, it's hard to believe that someone would name their philosophical school investigative, right? If that's what the word skeptikos means, the adjective skeptikos, if it means investigative, as it does, then they're not going to name your school skeptikos and call yourself the skeptikoi because you think investigations are useless or that knowledge is impossible. To understand more about this point, let me read off this passage from Sextus Empiricus. It is likely that for those investigating some matter, the result is either a discovery or the denial that there has been a discovery and an acknowledgement of the failure to grasp the truth, or else continuation of the investigation. Perhaps it is for this reason that in philosophical investigations, some said that they had found the truth, some denied that it was possible for the truth to be grasped, and some continue investigating. Those who are called dogmatists in the narrow sense believe that they have discovered the truth. For example, the Aristotelians, the Epicureans, the Stoics, and certain others. Among those who deny that truth can be grasped are Carneades, Cladamachus, and other academics. Those who continue investigating are the skeptics. Thus, it is reasonable that there should seem to be chiefly three philosophies: the dogmatic, the academic, and the skeptical. This is an important description of the skeptical project that I've just read here, where there are basically three kinds of results to any investigation: a belief that you've discovered what you set out to discover, a belief that you failed to discover the thing you wanted to discover, or that you continue the investigation. In this passage, Sextus Empiricus has said that there are three ways for an investigation to go, right? Again, that means you either found the thing, didn't find the thing, or are continuing the investigation. Correspondingly, there are the dogmatists, the academics, and the skeptics. These are three kinds of philosophical schools. We don't have to go far to get examples of these schools and these thinkers according to Sextus in this passage. He names them for us. The dogmatists are people like Plato and Aristotle and Epicurus and so on, who believe they've discovered the truth. Is the soul immortal? Is there an afterlife? Does God exist? What is the basic structure of reality? What is the good life? And so on. All of these schools have gone through an investigation and they have ended the investigation because they think they found the truth. It's true that all these schools think that, and yet they disagree among themselves. Right? The Stoics and the Epicureans and the Aristotelians deny the immortality of the soul. The Stoics might believe that the soul could survive the death of the body, but not forever. It too would be destroyed in the conflagration that destroys the cosmos. But Plato, for example, believes that the soul is immortal. So there's disagreement among these schools. So it's not like they found the same truth, but they all think they found the truth. And then in addition, there are these academics, and the academics believe that discovering the truth is impossible. And so these people are thinkers like Carneades, whom Sextus has mentioned in this passage. And the academics are well known in antiquity, but they're less well known to people today. So I'll just give you some brief rundown on what this school of philosophy was. The academics are basically what you think that skeptics are, given the name skeptics or skepticism. The academics believe that knowledge is impossible because the academics follow the train of thought that they see in Platonic dialogues, where, for example, it's said that wisdom is knowing that you don't know, especially pertaining to lofty subjects like what is justice and what's the structure of reality and so on. And so, in following these lines of thought in Plato's dialogues, they eventually run Plato's Academy this way. So many of Plato's successors initially followed Plato's own thought in being a dogmatist, but the academics believe they're following the true train of thought in Platonic dialogues in instead denying that knowledge is possible. There's another thing you see often in many of the Platonic dialogues at the end in puzzlement, that there's no actual resolution to the main question being given. In fact, the characters sort of agree to disagree, sometimes unhappily. But the point is that some of Plato's dialogues aren't dogmatic, but are instead what we'd call aporetic, meaning that they are puzzling, that they end in puzzlement. The academics believe that this is the true train of thought in Plato's dialogue, so they end up becoming the people running Plato's academy for several generations. That's why they're called academics. That's academics with a capital A. And they think that discovering the truth is impossible. Meanwhile, the skeptics don't deny that the truth is possible or that discovery of the truth is possible. Instead, they are those who continue the investigation. The skeptics instead declare what seems true to them at any given moment, depending on where they're at in an investigation. They're acting sort of like a reporter. They're reporting to you their impressions, their seemings, what seems true to them at any moment. Sometimes people in academia today will give what they call like readers' reports on a paper. So you're commenting on someone's paper and you're leaving little comments along the way, and and it's true that you are aware that some of the things you're commenting might be resolved by the end of the paper, but you're just telling the reader what you think as you're reading that part of the paper. You're giving a report depending on, and the content of your report depends on where you're at in the paper at the moment. And that's what the skeptics think they're doing. They're continuing the investigation and declaring what seems true to them at the moment, depending where they're at in the investigation. In practice, of course, that what this looks like is that you're identifying what the dogmatists believe and why they believe it, and you're arguing against it. But you're arguing in the sense of constantly asking why. What's the basis of this belief? How do you deal with this counterexample? You're not arguing against it in the sense of you have your own rival dogmatic theory and you're rolling that theory out to destroy someone else's view. You're not doing that. Hypothetically, of course, you could have you could adopt a view for the sake of argument to wonder like, I wonder what your reply would be to this objection hypothetically. But that's even a very different mode than what the skeptics are actually doing, which is they're testing, they're probing. They're asking you, well, how are you going to deal with this natural objection? In other words, it looks like what Socrates is doing for a lot of Plato's dialogues, which is that he goes up to someone, asks them what they think about some question, and then depending on what they've given in response, Socrates tests that. He asks probing, difficult questions. In that sense, the skeptics are following models that we might have seen in Plato's dialogues, but he's doing so very differently than the academics did, like Carneades. Again, Carneades actually believes that knowledge is impossible, or at least that's at least Sextus Empiricus's reading of Carneades. That's his interpretation of Carneades' views. So let's explore some of this process a little bit more. So during the process of arguing against the dogmatists, the skeptics are in what they would call the investigative phase. So this is related to their name, skeptikos, investigative. They're in the skeptikos phase, the skeptical phase, the investigative phase. That means that they are, again, asking these probing questions. But when you realize that the arguments don't work, when it is realized, whether it's you or the person you're arguing against, realize that the arguments don't work, they don't go through, that there was some objection that's thrown a wrench into the arguments. That's called the suspensive phase, because you are suspending judgment. you no longer think that you know. And if you are the skeptic who was arguing against the dogmatist, then now you know that you're not going to know from this inquiry the answer to the question. Someone gives you an account of justice, you argue with them, you probe, you ask them difficult questions. That's the investigative phase. But when it's clear that this ultimately is not going to work out, then you enter the suspensive phase. So when we look at the investigative phase, the idea is that the skeptic presents the dogmatists with arguments or objections or replies that are equally plausible to the arguments that support the dogmatist's conclusion. Again, what you do is that you try to identify an objection or an argument or reply or whatever that is just as plausible as the arguments that support the dogmatist conclusions, but these ones, the ones you're ruling out, support the opposite conclusion. And that's going to tie into this belief that's at the core of ancient Pyrrhonian skepticism, that says that for every argument there is an opposing argument with equal force or plausibility. Again, for every argument there's an opposing argument with equal force or plausibility. Being presented with equally plausible arguments for and against something is intended to induce in you and intended to induce in anyone who's listening to you suspension of judgment. That's how we go from the investigative phase to the suspensive phase, is with the presentations of arguments or objections or replies that are equally plausible to the ones that are on the opposite side. Then that induces suspension of judgment, and now everyone's in the suspensive phase. Once you've achieved suspension of judgment, Sextus Empiricus believes that you'll enter a state of being free from disturbance. This idea of freedom from disturbance, tranquility is another translation. The Greek term is ataraxia. This idea of freedom from disturbance popped into ancient Greek philosophy through Epicurus and Epicureanism. It's in Stoicism too, but I think less explicitly, and with some different terminology. But the idea here is that you'll achieve a kind of calmness from knowing that you don't know. That's the skeptical idea here, that you'll achieve a state of calmness from knowing that you don't know. Sextus believes that we enter into inquiries in the first place. We enter into investigations in the first place in the hopes of finding what's true, right? Unlike the academic skeptics, the Pyrrhonian skeptics believe that knowledge is possible. They want to resolve their doubts, so they enter in this investigation. And by the way, that's why we call them Pyrrhonian skeptics, to distinguish them from academic skeptics. But usually in a Pyrrhonian skeptical text, you'll just hear the academic skeptics called academics. We call Pyrrhonian skepticism Pyrrhonian because it's associated with this guy, Pyrrho, who existed before Sextus Empiricus. And Sextus Empiricus is the guy who rightly occupies our interest today because he is such an important figure in ancient skepticism, even though it's not his name that gets lent to the school. All right, but the important thing to know is that the Pyrrhonian skeptics believe that we enter into inquiries in the first place in the hopes of finding what's true. We want to resolve our doubts, so we enter into this investigation. But because of the fact that for every argument, there's an equally plausible opposing argument, the dogmatists never rest easy. The dogmatists are constantly bothered by the fact that they believe their arguments, but also there are dogmatists out there with the opposite views. So that creates a kind of disturbance. The skeptics exist to provide this calmness, to provide the tranquility that follows the realization that dogmatism is futile. So let me read this passage. Having begun to philosophize in order to judge things as true as false, so that he could attain freedom from disturbance. He tripped upon the equal weight of incompatible arguments. Thereupon, not being able to make a judgment, he suspended judgment. End quote. So again, we enter philosophy because we want to judge things as true or false in order to attain the freedom attain the rest and calmness and tranquility that comes from having the answers to our burning questions. We eventually stumbled upon, tripped upon the fact that there are actually incompatible arguments that are equally plausible or powerful. And then that realization induced in us the suspension of judgment, and then we got the calmness we wanted. Since the skeptic rejects dogmatism, you might wonder whether the skeptic resists any kind of belief whatsoever. Does this mean that skeptics have no beliefs at all? And there is some matter of debate about this, and I'll introduce the two views. So remember what I've said before, and what everyone agrees upon in this debate, this scholarly debate agrees upon, is that the skeptics talk about reporting what seems true to them at one moment. If you felt cold, a skeptic wouldn't say, I am neither hot nor cold, right? The skeptic would say exactly what they feel. They would say, I feel cold. When Sextus Empiricus says that the skeptics reject dogmatism, he means that they do not assent to something non-evident investigated by the sciences, end quote. So let me read that again, that they do not assent to something non-evident investigated by the sciences. What that means is that there are hidden, non-evident things out there that sciences investigate. And the skeptics do not want to assent to that. They don't want to agree to non-evident things that scientists have to investigate. And in antiquity, science was very general. We can just say that science means whatever. Basically, what is there something that involves theoretical reasoning here? So certainly math was theoretical and therefore a science. Philosophy, theoretical, therefore a science. Astronomy, same thing. But the term extends very widely, much more widely than we would use the term today. Grammar is a science in antiquity. Just, is there some theoretical reasoning there? If so, it is a science. But whether you feel cold is evident to you, right? If you feel cold, that's going to be evident to you. That's not something non-evident investigated by the sciences. So if something is not evident, and if it is investigated by some theoretical discipline, then you shouldn't have a belief about it according to the skeptics, right? If something is hidden or non-evident, and if it's investigated by some theoretical discipline, it's not the sort of thing that the skeptics are going to have beliefs about. But some interpreters disagree with what I just said. They say that according to Sextus, it's true, we shouldn't assent to something non-evident, but they say nothing is evident according to Sextus, and therefore Sextus means you can't have beliefs about anything. Now, even if you hold this view, even the scholars who hold this view would say that according to ancient skepticism, you have to live according to what seems true at any moment, but not have any beliefs about it. So what other scholars say is, yes, the skeptics can report what seems true. They can live according to these reports, but the skeptics really can't have beliefs about anything. And I disagree. I think that when the text says that you do not assent to something non-evident investigated by the sciences, I think that actually does mean you can assent to some things. But the question really comes down to, are there any such evident things for you to assent to? That's really what the question comes down. Some people say, no, don't have beliefs about anything, just live according to reports. And then there are people like me who think that what you have to live according to reports, but also you could have beliefs about things that are evident. So what I think is that Sextus Empiricus intended to develop a philosophical school with a goal, freedom from disturbance, and a strict methodology that included, for example, the investigative phase and then the induction of suspension of belief, and then that's followed by freedom from disturbance. So I think that you get a goal and a strict methodology, and that they're just trying to avoid having beliefs about non-evident hidden things. But I'll admit it's sexist. It's hard to interpret about this. And some people out there might say, no, the skeptics mean you don't have beliefs about anything. So I'll try to give you an example of what Sextus would say about a certain subject. Ancient medicine was conducted in different ways. Some people believed that you should begin your thinking from the nature of the cosmos. So you have to think first about the nature of the cosmos and then discover the four elements that make up everything: earth, air, fire, and water. And then you discover what treatments work according to the nature of each of the elements, and you figure out how the elements are related to the seasons and to various corners of the world and the various winds. And then you begin to put together diagnoses and treatment options that refer to these things you've discovered about the nature of the cosmos. So your medical knowledge makes reference to the cosmology and cosmological facts that you began by developing. But Sextus Empiricus doesn't believe in that way of doing ancient medicine. In fact, he was a doctor himself, and his name, Empiricus, reflects that he belonged to an empirical school of medicine. So Empiricus wasn't like his name, like his birth name, but it was a title, Empirikos, that he said he belonged to the empirical school of ancient medicine. And empiricists in ancient medicine are people who deny the existence of hidden, non-evident causes of disease. And so they basically prioritize experimenting with different treatment options and then going with what's observed to work. And they hold off theorizing or making complicated hypotheses in order to just stick closely to what works. Now, what about the belief that for every argument, there's an equally powerful opposing argument? Let's talk a little bit more about this idea. This idea is what we call equipollence, which comes from a Latin word meaning equally powerful. You could think of equi like in equidistant or equal, and then pollens is a word from which we get power and ability, strength. Equipollence is this idea that for every argument, there's an equally powerful opposing argument. Now, a couple of things to note about this. First, Sextus believes that it's indeed the case that there is an opposing argument that would show that this is false. Okay, so yes, he believes that there is an opposing argument that believes that says that even equipollence is false. Right? It cancels it out in that way. But that very fact doesn't disabuse the skeptic because it just induces the same kind of suspension of judgment. So I know that can be a little weird, but I'm sure it occurred to some of you that if there is an equally powerful argument for every single argument, then wouldn't there be an argument showing that even equipollence is false? After all, there should be an argument equally powerful to this skeptical position. And actually, I can tell you that is exactly what the skeptics think. There is an argument that goes against even equipollence. But that doesn't disabuse the skeptic. That doesn't change their mind. It just induces the same sort of suspension of judgment. Moreover, the skeptic offers up the idea of equipollence, knowing that it's going to be or could be canceled out by some other belief. Therefore, when the skeptic offers up this idea of equipollence, he does so undogmatically, offering it up merely as something that strikes him as true at the moment. So again, equipollence just ends up being an idea that's repeated. It's not actually a dogmatic belief that the Stoics have or doctrine or commitment. It's actually something that he offers up given where he's at in the moment, in investigative phase. He offers up the idea of equipollence. Now, I highlight this because the idea of equipollence is the hardest part of ancient skepticism for a lot of people to get their minds around. A lot of students I've had have struggled with this idea because they struggle with the idea that there could always be an equally powerful counter argument. Oftentimes, the reason for the difficulty is that we usually end up reading and talking to people who agree with us. So we end up spending time with the people who agree with us and not spending time with the people who don't. Um, we might find that every time someone makes a claim, there's an objection if we actually spent time arguing with people who disagree with us instead of talking to people who don't agree with us, right? What the skeptics predict is that if we actually cultivated time with the people who disagree with us, we would find that there's always an objection. There's always a reply to the objection. There's always an objection to the reply. There's always a reply to that objection, an objection to that reply, and so on. There's always a circle people go around here, right? And we often are just not clued into that because we tend to congregate with people who agree with us. Just as there's always an opinion, right? People always have their own opinions. There's always a reply to those opinions. But when the skeptic proposes equipollence, it's because it seems true to them at the moment, not because they think it's going to be some amazing idea that defies all objections. There is no unobjectionable idea, according to the skeptics. Again, this idea of reporting what seems true to you allows the skeptic to say that honey is sweet. The skeptic can say, honey is sweet. Why? Because it seems so to me. It looks like I've got this dogmatic commitment that's violating my skeptical credentials. But in reality, I'm not telling you that I'm dogmatic about the sweetness of honey. I'm just reporting to you how it seems to me. Honey is sweet. But if the skeptic began investigating as Plato did or Aristotle did, right, they look into the nature of sweetness. Plato would say that the honey is sweet because of its relationship to these intelligible objects like the forms that guarantee that honey is sweet. And Aristotle would say that this honey is sweet because it has the form of sweetness. And the Epicureans would say, well, the nature of sweetness is actually just a matter of its having this configuration of atoms in such a way that renders it sweet. And if the atoms were a little different, it would be sour because that's the nature of sourness and so on. But that's a step. These are steps towards dogmatism. Investigating that way is a dogmatic thing, is a dogmatist thing, right? It's something that dogmatists do. But the skeptics believe that you can talk about the appearance through these reports without holding forth on what the essence is or even whether there are essences to begin with. If we can do this, we can achieve the freedom of disturbance that dogmatists originally saw on their dogmatism. Remember that the dogmatist begins the inquiry in the same way that the up and coming skeptic does. They want to get an answer to their question. Their right inquiring minds just have to know. They're burning with a desire to answer these questions. And so the skeptic and the dogmatist enter with the investigations, hoping they can finally rest when the conversation is over, when the investigation's over. But the dogmatist ends up being disturbed constantly because they find an answer, then they have to deal with an onslaught of objections, and the onslaught will never end because of equipollence. Every argument has an equally plausible counter argument. But the skeptic is the person who says, well, you know what? I guess that I have to suspend judgment now. I'm not going to hold forth on whether knowledge is possible or impossible, but I just have to suspend judgment. And that's how I achieve my state of calmness. The skeptics believe that the calmness the dogmatists wanted is actually achieved by being a skeptic instead. Someone who believes that something is honorable or bad will be disturbed. If you think that something is bad and then you get that thing, or you lose something that you think is good, you'll feel disturbed. So that's another point we need to make here, that if you think something is bad and then you get that thing, or if you lose something that you think is bad, right? If you get a disease, if you think disease is bad and you get a disease, you'll feel disturbed. If you lose something you think is good, like wealth, you'll feel disturbed. But the skeptics believe that when you get something good, or when you get something that you believe is good, you stumble into a kind of irrationality through your own joy, right? Your own pleasure, your own elation. And then you act in a way that's counter to your own tranquility and calmness in order to hold on to the things you think are good. But if you determine nothing in regard to things honorable or bad, then you won't flee or going about things excessively. If again, if you in your mind make up your mind that nothing is if you don't make up your mind about anything being honorable or bad, right? If you suspend judgment instead, you're not going to flee or go about things excessively. There's an ancient Greek painter, Apelles, whose story here is illustrative, I think. Apelles was trying to paint a horse and he couldn't get a detail just right. So, in frustration, he throws the brush at the painting. He finds that the brush hit the painting in just the right way, that it painted the detail just perfectly. The skeptic is in a similar state. He suspended judgment upon realizing he couldn't get the answers he wanted. But in doing so, he got what he really wanted anyway: freedom from disturbance. He gets that through suspending judgment, which isn't really what he thought was going to actually lead to it. In case you're wondering whether even the skeptical theory of how freedom from disturbance arises, remember, even that is actually just another report. Oh, I was investigating this yesterday. Then I suspended judgment. And you know what? I feel a lot better now. I feel a lot calmer. I have my state of freedom from disturbance or ataraxia now. Sextus Empiricus channels his status as a doctor when he compares opinions on non-evident matters, opinions on hidden matters, to diseases. The way that we cure those diseases is through the application not of a drug, but through a counter argument. We show that there's an equally powerful argument, and then we illustrate the idea of equipollence, or we represent the idea of equipollence, and then as a result, we've achieved the state of ataraxia. We're like, oh well, I guess there's no decisive answer here presented yet, so I'm going to suspend judgment. Oh wait, that's made me feel better now. So the skeptic isn't committed to the dogmatism that this is the way we live the good life with a capital T, a capital G, and a capital L, right? The idea is that the skeptic has tried this out and noticed that freedom from disturbance follows the skeptical procedure, just like they notice that a shadow follows our body when we walk around, right? Yes, we've eliminated the disturbances that come from constant, agitated, dogmatic inquiry. We've also eliminated the disturbances that come from having beliefs about what's good and bad. We've eliminated these things and therefore achieved the good life, just like a painter throwing a brush in frustration and walking away from the canvas and then realizing, oh, wait, this has made the painting actually perfect. I didn't intend that, but that's what happened. Still, though, the skeptic has troubles, right? The skeptic might still be thirsty. She might be hungry and thirsty and tired. But other people are hungry and thirsty and tired. But the skeptic just feels the hunger, the thirst, the exhaustion. Other people have the belief too that this is bad. And that feeling of that belief is generating some extra disturbance for them. The skeptic has a more moderate kind of pain when she actually has any kind of pain, because she doesn't have the disturbance that comes from having the dogmatic beliefs in addition to the hunger, the thirst, the exhaustion, right? That, and those dogmatic beliefs say hunger and thirst and exhaustion are bad, which compounds the disturbance. Right. So remember the point about empirical medicine, ancient empirical medicine that I mentioned earlier. We follow what we observe works. That's the point when it comes to this skeptical idea. So let me talk about some of these ideas a little bit more as I conclude here. Let's consider this point. What does it mean to suspend judgment? Here's what Sextus Empiricus says when it comes to this question about what it means to suspend judgment. I cannot say which of the objects before me I should put my trust in and which I cannot. End quote. This phrase reflects the skeptical view that for every argument that strikes us as being so powerful, there's another argument that strikes us as being just as powerful, but that leads to opposite conclusions. That's what it means. That's what suspension of judgment amounts to, is I don't know, do I go with A or do I go with B where B entails not A, right? That's the question. I don't know. And so I'm not going to try to dogmatically propound A or B, right? Where B implies not A. So I recognize that equipollence probably still is raising some eyebrows here. Let's think about one obvious objection that would come to mind here. What if the skeptic is presented with an argument that can't be refuted, right? That he or she is incapable of refuting at any rate. Here's an obvious question about equipollence that I'm sure is raising some eyebrows for you guys listening to this. What if the skeptic is presented with an argument that he or she can't refute? What if you gave me an argument and I can't think of an equally powerful argument against it? Have you now destroyed the idea of equipollence? Sextus Empiricus thinks that we should reply in the following way. You should think to yourself that there was a time when the person who invented your argument didn't exist. Before that argument was invented, it wasn't clear that this person was right. After all, the evidence hadn't been put together yet. No, right? No one had actually put together the argument, right? If the argument wasn't invented, it wasn't clear that this position was right. So maybe it was just sitting there waiting for someone to put it together. Similarly, the argument that refutes your argument is just waiting for someone to come and invent it, even if it hasn't been put together yet. So if that's not quite clicking in your head, imagine a conversation between me and a dogmatist, and I'm the skeptic. The dogmatist gives me a great argument that the soul is immortal, and I can't figure out how to refute it. Is this it? Is this the end of skepticism and the vindication of this dogmatist believer in the immortality of the soul? Sextus says no, because I, the skeptic, should say, look, right now, you have this great argument. It's convincing you that your position's awesome. That's great. But there was a time before your argument came into existence. No one had made your argument yet. It was therefore not clear at that time whether your position was right, because no one had developed this awesome argument that you now have, right? And so I think my argument that destroys your position, my objection, my reply to your argument that destroys your argument, that's equally powerful, that should induce suspension of judgment in you and in me. I should say to you that argument is just waiting somewhere around. I can't come up with it yet. I can't see it yet. But one day someone will propose an objection that defeats your argument and vindicates the idea of equipollence. But my argument is in the same position now that your argument was in before you discovered it. Namely, it was just waiting out there for someone to discover it in the wings. So when we're thinking about this idea of equipollence, we shouldn't think of it as a demand or a requirement that skeptics everywhere actually do provide this opposing argument. They're stating the fact that just as every dogmatist can provide an argument for their own position, they also can provide an objection to every other dogmatist position. In other words, they're stating there is an argument out there that supports any given view you could come up with. Sure, we don't always know what that argument is going to be yet, but that's okay. These things happen gradually over a period of time. The skeptic isn't putting on themselves the requirement to actually give the equally powerful argument, equally powerful counter argument, equally powerful objection or reply. They're just stating, yeah, look, the Platonists have this dogmatic view. Aristotelians have the opposite dogmatic view, and Epicureans have the opposite dogmatic view of both of them. And Stoics had a view, an argument that competed with all of those. That's bearing out this idea that there is equally powerful dogmatic arguments for every position. Look, and just look at it. Every dogmatist out there has an argument for their own position. It convinces them, and it's opposed to every other dogmatist argument. Right? In other words, we could always come up with new opposing arguments, but that's not the same thing as saying that the skeptics have to come up with new opposing arguments, or that the skeptics have come up with every argument that ever needs to be come up with, that needs to be invented, right? That's the point. Of course, there's so much else we can say about skepticism, and I'm sure in other episodes we'll look into it more. There is way more to be said about the skeptical idea of the good life. And again, that's not supposed to be a dogmatic theory of the good life. But there is something to be said for what the skeptics believe about tranquility, freedom from disturbance in non-dogmatic ways. And of course, the listener is able to come up with an objection that says, actually, the skeptics are violating their own requirements to not be dogmatists. They are actually secretly dogmatists. As a listener, you can hold that view, no doubt about that. But the skeptics at least think that they've developed a non-dogmatic view to what it means to live well. And it's a competitor to all the other dogmatist views, to all the other dogmatist views, the views out there that are held by other people and that are dogmatists. And I'm sure in other episodes we will look at that. But I think this suffices for our look now at ancient skepticism. With that in mind, I will say thank you for listening. You can subscribe to the Ancient Philosophy podcast wherever you find podcasts, such as Apple Music and Spotify. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also find the Substack that I run at Plato's fishtrap.substack.com. And I also have a book available for purchase, An Introduction to the Ethics of Social Media, which you can find wherever you buy books, such as Amazon, or you can buy it directly through the publisher, which is Hackett. Thank you very much.